Good evening. My name is Bob Carey. I'm president of the New School. I want to welcome you all here. My job initially was to introduce Chris Ward. He had an emergency phone call, and he's asked me to filibuster this introduction. So, first of all, this is the third annual program. So you ready to be introduced? This is the third annual program of the Port Authority Speaker Series at the Center for New York City Affairs at Milano, the New School for Management and Urban Policy, and the graduate program in International Affairs. The series is something that we're thrilled to have here at the New School because Milano has had a rich and a very organic relationship with the Port Authority for close to 30 years. Andrew White wrote these comments and characteristically did not include any praise for himself and the Center for New York City Affairs. But the Center for New York City Affairs is a very important organization in the city of New York, and we're proud to have it a part of Milano. And I would say that pound for pound, Andrew White and his team have as big an impact as any institution in the city of New York. And we're very grateful, Andrew, for your efforts for this particular program and for many others that you've done through the center. Milano alums have worked in several very different parts of the Port Authority, from the Executive Director's Office under Peter Goldmark to the management of Kennedy Airport to small business development and community outreach. Today, an alumnus and board member of Milano, Paul Travis, and his company, Washington Square Partners, are development advisors and lead negotiators on Moynihan Station, the topic we will explore tonight. Washington Square Partners led the effort to determine the development program and deal structure for the project, and they market it to developers. Paul is very engaged. Paul is a very generous supporter of Milano, as well as the entire university. He's a star alumnus of our school. We're very proud of his professional accomplishments, and we're very proud of his civic contributions as well. For all these reasons and more, the Port Authority Speaker Series has been a fitting way to take our partnership to another level. And we're very grateful to the Port Authority for underwriting it and making it possible. So please join me in giving Andrew White, the Port Authority, Paul, and all of Milano's friends and supporters for this event. The Center for New York City Affairs in Milano organized the Speaker Series as a part of their larger mission, which is to promote policy innovations that strengthen neighborhoods and improve the effectiveness of government. The Center's combination of policy research, journalism, and exploration of the role of politics in local and state government policy represents a critically important aspect of this school. Tonight's program is part of a long-standing tradition at Milano, promoting constructive, intelligent, and useful dialogue on the issues. Planning and implementing large-scale development projects, particularly transportation-related projects like Moynihan Station, are crucial to the city's growth. And New York has had many development projects in the works, from Manhattan's West Side to the new municipal recycling facility at Sunset Park. Today, we hope to learn about the complexity of the implementation of these projects. In 1993, the late Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was my best friend in the United States Senate, and if you've not had the opportunity to read the edited collection of his letters and memos done by Stephen Wiseman, I would urge you, if you're trying to understand the range of policy and politics over the approximately 50 years of his service, what is unfortunately not included in there is that Moynihan had a great eye for design, a great eye for design. In the '61 inaugural parade, the President and First Lady asked Arthur Goldberg to do a plan to rebuild Pennsylvania Avenue, which was, I would say, in worse shape than 42nd Street was 20 years ago. And Moynihan spent the next 40 years of his life working with a senior partner at SOM to design that project, to fund, to build, at times to save places like Union Square. He swapped a piece of land in Staten Island for the Triangle Park that became the final piece. And thanks to me, there's a Moynihan Place on Pennsylvania Avenue. And because of his deep distrust of the Central Intelligence Agency and secrecy, I put that provision in the black section of the 1990 Intelligence Authorization Bill. Moynihan Place on Pennsylvania Avenue, I'm proud to say, is classified top secret. So 20 years later, the project is now ready to break ground. We'll explore what was behind the delays and why it is the nature of so many major public development projects, and are there lessons, in short, to be learned from the Moynihan experience for future planning. Our first speaker tonight is Chris Ward, who's the Executive Director of the Port Authority. His bio, as well as the bios of all the speakers, are in your programs, and I'd like to highlight a few of Chris's accomplishments, if he doesn't mind. And he didn't shake his hand, so I'm going to proceed. Chris's job requires him to combine policy and politics at every decision. That includes the World Trade Center, the airports, the ports, the bridges, and the tunnels. The essence of his job is also the core of what students learn here at Milano, understanding and analyzing vexing urban and organizational problems and coming up with appropriate workable solutions. He's not only a much desired speaker at Milano, but he is, I believe, the role model of what a public servant has to be. He has to be persistent. He has to have the capacity to listen to all sides. He has to have the willingness to avoid, if possible, rewarding bad behavior, as he explained to me the other evening. But most of all, I hope without the use of Xanax or some other drugs, he has to stay calm in the presence of constant crises, calm in the presence of constant unreasonable demands, calm in the presence of almost daily delivery of bad news. And persevering, I believe, Chris Ward does as a consequence of his love for this remarkable place. Ladies and gentlemen, the Executive Director of the Port Authority, Chris Ward.
I was told to keep my remarks brief to allow Bob that long introduction. I love the anecdote about the Moynihan Place and the CIA. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to my fellow panelists for this conversation tonight. I hope that Mr. David will lead us through in terms of lessons learned from Moynihan Station. I'm here to give you a little bit of a place setter, if you will, for where we are today, where the project is, where it's going forward, and then a little bit of taste, I think, on why we are where we are today. I think one of the things that Bob was hinting at is that this town is writ large with visions of huge projects, and I've talked about this elsewhere. And when you think about the huge projects that have been envisioned, luckily, some of them didn't make it. Some of them, great projects, unfortunately, didn't make it either. You know, you can talk about the ones, Moses' idea of a throughway across Canal Street might have been a little devastating to this community in particular, but the city. On the other hand, the Port Authority's original plan to build the George Washington Bridge was at 59th Street. That might have been a little daunting for Midtown traffic if that's where the George Washington Bridge had been. And you can go through the history of the UN and the size and the vision of what the UN might be. You could look back to Trump Television City at one point in visions for the West Side. So I think for students here, the tension between visions and, in some cases, monumental visions and what gets built and what doesn't get built, I think is an always fascinating study of New York City because, you know, we take the built environment as an inevitable, but it really was at a moment in time things did happen. I love to use the idea that Central Park was envisioned when there were cow fields and sheep being herded on either side of it, and the idea that you would need Central Park to make New York City viable today was really a remarkable set of vision and a capacity to pull off a monumental project. So Moynihan Station, and where are we today? We are at a particular time in Moynihan Station that is at odds with that very vision, which I think, I'll be corrected, but has been launched on a monumental basis at least 2, if not potentially 3 times. And where we are today is the consequence of those earlier monumental visions or large-scale visions or comprehensive visions for Daniel Patrick Moynihan's sense of a grand new entrance, because each one of those did fail. And I won't go into why they failed, but I will say that at least the last great vision, which was the opportunity to move Madison Square Garden, open up the top of Penn Station, bring in light and air, move the garden on the other side of Farley Moynihan Station, was a project of huge scale, breadth, and vision that I believe was actually doable. It could have happened, but it didn't. So out of, I don't want to say the ashes of that, but out of that collapse, there was a new initiative that was undertaken with Governor Patterson's office and with the Port Authority and with Tim Gilchrist, who you'll hear from, that for too long this project suffered from the very vision that was, in a sense, creating it, that every time you wanted to think about what Moynihan could be, and if there was a problem, you made it that much bigger to solve that problem. And with it came the weight of all those other visions and the complexity of moving Madison Square Garden, reimagining Penn Station, and all of those complexities brought this project to, unfortunately, a halt. But with that, one of the themes that I also want to get across is there are times of political leadership and there are times of a political congruence which allows large-scale complex projects to happen. And there was the wrong, I will be candid here, there was the wrong political leadership framework and time for that last vision of Moynihan to, I think, get realized. So where are we today? We're at a modest place. We're at the beginning of a very different sense of how Moynihan might get built. And rather than focusing on the larger vision of a new gateway into the city, an economic revitalization of an area around Penn Station, which surely can do more in New York City, we have focused, the Port Authority and Governor Patterson's office, we have focused on rather a very small but tangible incremental step of construction. The notion being that if you start it, it has to get finished. So taking away all of the other aspects above ground, we have focused on the transportation initiatives below ground and launched that as the first step for the larger vision. And so the value of this project, we think, is in starting it, our partners, both the federal government, the states, the MTA, will then incrementally be allowed to bring on board the larger vision over time. So we are in what we call phase one of the transportation project, and that is to take the underground portions of Penn Station and do things like extend 8 tracks further west underneath Farley to allow access from the western portion of the concourse, to have 13 different access points from the western concourse down onto the platforms for easier commuter access during those periods, to extending and widening corridors so more and more people can use these additional access points, and that the location is brighter, lighter, easier to use, and has the kind of transportation and safety benefits that people expect. It's a modest part of this project. It is only $267 million. But the key point within this modest part of it is the Port Authority and the state received the largest Tiger grant from the federal government to start this project. And that was a very, very important signal from the Obama administration, which was embracing this strategy that said, yes, we've heard it before, you guys have talked about it a lot, but start small and we'll be your partner. Build the things that you know you have to build to get transportation benefits, and we will be your partner subsequently to that, when the larger vision of even better transportation improvements to the facility can be made, and then creating the Grand Hall that Moynihan so desperately wanted. That can then be the second phase of the project. But I leave with perhaps the most important part of this phase, was really a partnership now with Amtrak, that Amtrak would, in fact, after all these difficult years, move its base of operations from Penn Station, that wonderful, crowded, low-hanging ceiling where you can't find a place to sit, you can't put a cup of coffee down, and everybody's scrambling to wonder, well, I guess that this platform is going to be the same platform the last time I took a train, that Amtrak has said, no, in fact, that's not going to work for us. We will move over into a new Penn Station when it's actually completed. I think that is the signature breakthrough that this incremental approach gets us, because it then moves the center of density finally over to the western part of Farley, and it gives customers, travelers, a reason to go there. And I think that is really the moment in this part of phase one that is so important. So yes, today we are modest. We are starting small. We are only building, a limited amount of benefits today, but they are tangible. They make the station where Long Island Railroad, Amtrak, and Metro North will all use. It will be real. If, unfortunately, the larger vision doesn't happen, this has useful benefits for today, and we should do them today. But we think it's the seed that really then plants for the larger growth of Penn Station, which will take time. This part of the project we hope to start beginning of the summer of 2011. It's a 3 to 4 year construction time frame, and within that, working with the Obama administration, we are very hopeful that the next phase of this project, the larger vision, can be realized. So that's my place setter for the introduction. I think our narrator, nominator, or questioner will be asking questions for everybody to flesh out whether or not I was right or not. But I will now turn it over to the Dean to introduce your next guest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm Neil Graboy. I'm the Dean of the Milano School for Management and Urban Policy and the Graduate Program in International Affairs. Thanks to President Bob Kerrey, I now know that Xanax is available for deans as well, and I'm looking to find a place where I can purchase it. A little advertisement for Milano. Since you're here, it's conceivable you may want to become a student, get a degree, go on to do grand things, building on the grand things you've already done. We have at Milano a special commitment to the field of urban policy analysis and management. We offer master's degrees and PhD degrees, as well as classes that range from environmental policy and public finance to economic development and nonprofit management. It's a very special place. I've only been here 3 months, and I've already been intoxicated by what goes on, by the excitement of the place, by the quality of the faculty, and I highly recommend, we have a sign up in the back for new students. So if you're interested, we're delighted to have you. Milano education, with its singular combination of policy and practice, prepares our graduates to be especially effective in the urban policy arena. When I was thinking about tonight's program, I looked at the transcript from last year's panel and Chris's remarks in particular. He said that the limitations we face in our capacity to develop urban infrastructure necessitate a paradigm shift to emphasize the sense of innovation that led, for example, to the creation of the Port Authority. Chris, we appreciate having you back at Milano, urging us to explore innovative thinking about the future of transportation infrastructure. I especially want to thank you and the Port Authority for supporting this series at Milano about New York City's ports and economic development. Our next speaker tonight is Timothy Gilchrist, who was appointed president of the Moynihan Station Development Corporation by Governor Patterson in 2010. He's been the governor's senior advisor for transportation and infrastructure and chair of the New York State Economic Recovery and Reinvestment Cabinet. Mr. Gilchrist has already overseen the groundbreaking for Phase 1 for the new Penn Station, and I guess we say overseen the award of $83 million in Tiger funds from the U.S. Department of Transportation. The project, as you've heard a great deal about, will convert the Farley Post Office building into a much improved entry into the city, and I can't tell you how many times I've come into the city in earlier days, and I look forward for 4 years from now or whatever it will be, in the spirit of a kind of much beloved and mourned old Penn Station, modest as this new Farley station will be. We're very pleased to have our visitor here to speak with us tonight and share his knowledge and perspective on the Moynihan Station project and the insights it provides on the public infrastructure development process. Please join me in welcoming Timothy Gilchrist.
Thank you, Dean, for the introduction. Good evening, everybody. It's very nice to be here and to see this many people interested in your project. It's always, when you start off on a project, you hate to go to an event and have nobody there to talk about it. I'd like to thank the New School for hosting this event and the Port Authority for supporting this series, but also the great work that the Port Authority has done and under Chris's leadership and Andy Lynn, who's also here, and Laura and the team, to help us move forward, because this really is a partnership in delivering this project. And that is, well, as I'll talk about later, one of the major changes from earlier iterations of the project and moving it forward. Chris touched on what we're doing in phase one. And I think the only thing I'd like to add and emphasize there is all this work we're doing in phase one had to be done no matter what scheme there was developed for putting the new Amtrak, or at one point the New Jersey Transit Station, into the Farley building and building Moynihan Station. This was always the early action work. And the strategy that we developed to move this forward makes sure that necessary work is in place. And when we put the funding package together for the entire station, we can move that much faster towards completion than when we would have been able to do otherwise. But what I'd really like to do, because Chris covered that, is talk a little bit about what I see as were some of the reasons it's taken us so long to get here. I mean, the timeline that was handed out outside here that Juliet put together is very telling of the trials and tribulations of this project. I think I went to my first meeting on it in 1994. And when you have a project this long, you have phrases such as from 1993 to 2004, the project suffers several setbacks. And it really is telling. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And great public works take time. Alex is here. That takes people that are pushing it and visionary and driving it, and a succession of people to keep things going because you believe in the great works. But I think about major infrastructure projects failing, and in my career I've been involved with several. There's not going to be a tunnel at Ground Zero, for example. Other projects have failed, and they fail for a lot of reasons. And one of them is always the lack of agreement by all the stakeholders on the objectives for the project. And the second is there's not always realistic funding scenarios and planning that goes into the project. Importantly, the project timing doesn't always coincide with the political timing or the economic realities of what's going on. And you need to be able to build a project through several business cycles. And then, is there the proper organization there to actually deliver the project? Moynihan's obviously suffered from some of these throughout the years, and I'll talk a little bit about it. But I think one way to think about the Moynihan Station project is remember when this started, and back into the history of 1993, the plan was for the then Pennsylvania Station Development Corporation to lease 400,000 square feet from the post office and build the station. And the post office was going to continue to operate through there. Today, the Moynihan Station Development Corporation owns the building, or Empire State Development, my parent corporation, does, and the post office leases 400,000 square feet, soon to be about 250,000 square feet in the building. So the whole structure of how this was going to be transacted has changed dramatically in 20 years, and the post office has changed dramatically in 20 years. And the views in the country about rail transportation has changed dramatically in 20 years. So we're dealing with a lot different scenarios. But talking about whether or not there's clear objectives, whenever you're going to have a conversation about Moynihan Station, it's good to ask a question at the beginning. Do you think Moynihan Station is a transportation project, or do you think it's an economic development project? Or do you think it's both? As Chris outlined right now what we're building is a pure transportation project. When we move forward into the next phase, it's going to have economic development elements, but it's still going to be a transportation project. And there's nothing wrong with it being an economic development project. And there's nothing bad about that. It's just when you're trying to deliver a project, everybody's got to agree upon what you're delivering. And if part of the world thinks you're delivering an economic development project and part of the world thinks you're delivering a transportation project, you're never going to get through the entire process in doing that. And even the basic objective of having a train station in the Farley building hasn't always been a priority of all the stakeholders, including Amtrak over the years. So that alignment and the work we did to get Amtrak to agree to move everything over into the train station is going to be part of the success when we move forward. Funding is elusive for any kind of major project, but something like Moynihan has been particularly difficult. Until the passage of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act and the inclusion of TIGER, the discretionary transportation grants we got, there's never been a clear funding source for this project. We have cobbled together $200 million in other funding by putting in earmarks, applying for grants. Our funding was administered until this latest phase by 3 different federal transportation agencies moving forward. The Port Authority has been the most consistent and generous partner moving through this, and at crucial times throughout the project coming forward with money to help us move. But there's never been a real funding source that'll get us to do that. With the passage of the Recovery Act and the investment in high-speed rail in the United States, everybody really looked forward to that. Now we're in a new era, can move forward, there's an opportunity. With the recent changes in Congress and in some of the states, we're back in that battle. I mean, 2 governors have already announced that they're going to turn back their high-speed rail money, so people are going to be going after it. As I mentioned, the timing of the project can lead to its success or failure. The long lead time for environmental reviews, procurement, and the design process means you can lose your political support or your funding because you don't fit that economic cycle. A project that's been discussed since 1992 has gone through several governors, mayors, presidents, senators, and every time that support has to be lined up. And then finally, when all the stars align, there's all the funding, and you're ready to deliver the project, you've got to be capable of doing it. I come from an economic development agency. We fund projects, we deal with zoning, we move projects forward. We don't build transportation projects. And that's why the governor really demanded the partnership that we have with Chris. And that the Port Authority was so willing to help. They're devoting the transportation experts, the project experts, to work with the Moynihan Station Development Corporation to make sure that we can actually move this project forward. We can move forward on this phase today because we have a realistic budget and we have a partner that can help us deliver the project. We're going to do that as we move forward to put the funding together for the next phase. You know, and the lessons learned for the rest of the Moynihan project and for future projects really go back to those issues I touched upon about what will stop a project and why the projects can't move. So with that, I look forward to hearing the panel and turn it back over to the Dean.
Thank you very much, Tim. We really appreciate your remarks. It's now my pleasure to introduce Greg David, who will moderate our discussion this evening. Greg is the director of the Business Reporting Program at CUNY, Graduate School of Journalism, where he oversees the business and economic curriculum and teaches courses on covering the economy. It needs some covering. The New York City economy and Wall Street. He spent 33 years as a business journalist and as an editor at Cranes. Greg is one of the top journalists in the field, and as dean, I'm particularly proud to count him as a member of the faculty at Milano GPIA. And if his management of this discussion whets your appetite, you should consider enrolling here. Just another little. His course is called The New York Economy, Politics, and the Private Sector. Please join me in welcoming Greg to the podium.
And if you are enrolling and registering, it's for the spring semester. And there are about 10 students from my J School class, which is the same class. It has the journalism. You get the public policy part. So you can talk to them about what's in the class. We're here to continue the discussion by calling up a panel and going through the issues that have been presented. So I'll introduce them, and then everyone can come up. Vishaan Chakrabarty is the director of the Real Estate Development Program and Mark Holliday, professor of Real Estate Development at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. He's the founding principal of VCDC, an urban design firm based in Manhattan. Formerly an executive vice president of related companies, he ran the design operations for the firm's development portfolio, which included, guess what, Moynihan Station. From 2002 to 2005, he served as director of the Manhattan office for the New York City Department of Planning. You want to come up? Anna Hayes Levin is a commissioner on the New York City Planning Commission. She was a member of the Manhattan Community Board No. 4 and chair of its Clinton Hell's Kitchen Land Use Committee from April 2001 to March 2009. As a CB4 member, she served on the Hudson Yards Advisory Committee, the Moynihan Station Community Advisory Committee, and the board of the Clinton Seed Fund. From 1993 to 1999, she was vice president of legal affairs and general counsel for LVMH. Would you like to join us? Juliette Michelson is a senior planner at the Regional Plan Association, where she focuses on the relationship between transportation and land use. She has developed complex statistical models to estimate how improvements in transit service affect adjacent property values and make the case for building dense nodes of development around train stations. And the mayor loves you for that. Ms. Michelson also manages RPA's advocacy efforts on the far west side of Manhattan, including Moynihan Station, the Javits Convention Center, and the Hudson Rail Yards. Prior to joining RPA, Ms. Michelson was a project manager at the Project for Public Spaces. Finally, Tacumbo Shobolali is the Chief of Staff for the Economic Development in the City of New York's Office of the Mayor. Previously, he served as the Chief Operating Officer of the New York City Economic Development Corporation. He also served as an Executive Vice President overseeing strategy and policy, business development, and energy and telecommunications policy. Prior to joining NYC EDC, he was a strategy consultant for Dahlberg Development, a firm strengthening global public institutions. And last but not least, Chris Ward gets to join us again. He did tell me I was not supposed to ask him any questions. I said, too bad. I would like to start with a question that seems to me to be central to the discussion we've had up to now. Should Moynihan be one project? And if so, should it be a transportation project or an economic development project? We'll start with Vashon and we'll go down the road.
Thank you, Greg. And I should say, just for full disclosure, that I continue to consult on Moynihan Station with Related. It's interesting, as I look at it from the perspective of the cities we study at Columbia and our competitor cities, there isn't this distinction between transportation and economic development. Most of the cities with which we compete look at land use planning and transportation planning in conjunction, and that's because the greenest way to develop the growth that we need to develop in this city is by planning a lot of density around the kind of infrastructure capacity that occurs at a place like Penn Station. And so, whereas I very much applaud the state and what Tim and Chris have presented here in terms of what is now a more incremental approach, ultimately I think we do have to get to a comprehensive plan for the entire Penn Station area that includes Moynihan, that includes the land around Moynihan, the air rights that float above the Farley building. I think that will be critical in getting the entire thing to be successful. So I really don't get the distinction between a transportation project and an economic development project.
Anna?
Well, I should make clear, although my little tag up here says that I'm on the New York City Planning Commission, which is indeed the case, for the entire period that we're talking about tonight, up until the groundbreaking, I guess, a month or so ago, my involvement with this project was because of my involvement with Community Board 4. So nothing I'm talking about here tonight has anything to do with my work on the Planning Commission. I think in the local neighborhood, and Community Board 4's boundary, eastern boundary is 8th Avenue, so between Penn Station on the one hand, which is in Board 5, the Farley Building on the other, which is in Board 4, we go all the way, I shouldn't say we, I should say we, goes all the way over to the Hudson River. So during this stretch of time from 2000 to 2007-8, our neighborhood had to deal with a whole host of very large economic development and transportation planning projects. And I think Vishano has made the case to us in pitching why we needed to build the number 7 train in order to fulfill the vision of the Hudson Yards plan, that transportation was what laid the groundwork and was the engine that drove economic development. A lot of people in the board for neighborhood weren't so keen with the economic development vision, but I think we all understood the importance of the transportation vision. And when it comes to Moynihan Station, I think the view also is that it's the job of the public sector to work on the infrastructure and build the transportation, and that will trigger the economic development. But I think Vishan is also absolutely right. There are a whole lot of moving parts in this area that I think we're not getting the comprehensive plan, at least at the public level, that may have been one of the reasons that the larger plan collapsed.
Juliet?
I guess I'd like to bring in a few numbers here to make the transportation impacts of the Moynihan Station plan, even just this phase 1, make them a little more meaningful. This will ultimately be a real estate and economic development project for sure, but in the short term, it is absolutely a significant transportation improvement program. Even just phase 1, which is to say doubling the width of the corridor, the West End concourse that runs under the steps of the Farley building, and doubling its length so that it can be accessed from double the number of platforms than it does today, will increase the capacity of the entire station by about 2,000 passengers in the peak hour, which is about 5%, just to give you a rough idea, which, you know, is not completely overwhelming, but given how at capacity Penn Station currently is, every 5% helps. And also given the fact that, let's see, ARC isn't going to be happening anytime soon.
And we're going to get to that.
Again, every little bit helps. You know, on top of that, I should also say that in addition to a strict capacity increase, it will also reduce significantly the amount of time it will take for passengers to leave the station, which will result in just generally faster commutes every day, but also increased safety and security. I mean, if you've taken the train in from New Jersey Transit in the morning, you know, I'm sure we've all thought of what would happen if there was an emergency, and just phase 1 would increase egress times by decrease egress times by 20%, which is very significant.
Tacombo?
The advantage of being last on a panel like this is that all the good things have already been said. So
I'll make you first on the next question.
But I would just echo what Vashon and Anna said. I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy. I think if you look back at the history of the city, the economic development of New York City has been built upon our transportation system. If we didn't have the subway system we have, Brooklyn, Queens would not be tied integrally to the city's economy the way they are today. So I think transportation is economic development in this city. And a city of this density, without the transportation, we would grind to a halt. So I think, as Vashon said, it's important to do some of the other the vertical development things are important to the city, obviously, but the fundamental thing without which the city can't function as an economic engine is the basic mass transit infrastructure.
So you should sometimes not want what you wish for, because my next question comes back to you. There's this great anecdote in the New York Times once. The mayor's in a car with Christine Quinn and her partner, and Christine Quinn's partner looks at the mayor and says, they're going past Penn Station and says, when are you going to do something about this area? And the mayor looks at her and says, talk to her, it's her district. But that is important because fundamentally we have had a divide about how to develop the West Side for many years. One group, led by Chuck Schumer, wants to start at Moynihan Station and go west. The Bloomberg administration wants to leapfrog and go to Hudson Yards, which has always been their priority. So my question to you, and we'll get other members of the panel in, is how does Moynihan Station today fit in the Bloomberg's administration's view of how the West Side ought to be developed?
I think it's quite important. I mean, the West Side is a large area, and as we all know, people, New Yorkers are famous for optimizing their commutes and pre-walking on the subway platforms, where you're getting off before you enter the train. And so the difference of a few blocks actually makes a huge difference in New York terms. So having a great entrance from Moynihan is quite important, as is the 7 train. And I think given the density that we're talking about developing on the west side, it's going to be a lot of people. And so we need a lot of mass transit there. So I feel these two are not in opposition, they're complementary. And again, the other thing is that Moynihan Penn serves, national, regional, as well as local commuters. As Chris pointed out, there are 4 different railways that come in there. So the 7 train, they're different. They can meet different needs. So I think you need to have both, because New York City and Manhattan is not only a locality, but it's a state and regional and national attraction. We need to have a lot of transit options so we can make sure we get all the folks from a variety of distances in and out of the city. And so, in that sense, the 7-line extension and Moynihan Penn are complementary.
And I saw you're nodding your head yes. So
Well, no,
what do you
that-
think on this?
I think you're right. I've always thought that Moynihan Station should be the linchpin to development of the far west side. In the Hudson Yards rezoning, the focus was on creating these infinitely large towers along 11th Avenue opposite the convention center. That never made sense to me. The place for the high-density development is growing westward from Penn Station. That's going to have mass transit capacities far beyond anything the 7 train could ever deliver. There are 2 gigantic sites, the Brookfield sites on immediately across 9th Avenue from the Farley building, that are 15% of the commercial development plan for Hudson Yards. Do you want to bet whether those are going to develop first or the ones on 11th Avenue? I really think that it's got to start with Moynihan.
So, Vashon, you worked for a company that had fingers in both pies. Where are you on this?
Yeah, my fingers have been in too many pies. Look, I would characterize this differently. I understand what you're saying, but I'd characterize it differently. First of all, the Bloomberg administration, when it did the rezoning of the Hudson Yards, didn't stop at 10th Avenue. It rezoned all the way over to Madison Square Garden. In fact, the 2 million square feet that flowed above Farley came as a consequence of that rezoning, and I think will be critical to ultimately getting Farley done. So I think it's unfair to say that somehow the administration didn't value the Moynihan project or didn't value the goal of developing around there, including the Brookfield site that Anna was talking about. I do think where some of these distinctions come about aren't so much about the priority of one place versus the other, but about sort of jurisdiction of one place versus the other. And I think one of the struggles we've had consistently with this and other large projects in the city is that it is very difficult, for a lot of reasons that have nothing to do with the wonderful individuals involved, right, that it is very hard for the state and city to come together and do these big projects together for a whole variety of reasons. And I think there was a sort of understanding that Moynihan fell under the state's purview for a whole lot of reasons, and the rezoning around Hudson Yards and getting the number 7 going actually turned into a massive city initiative, very much with the state's partnership in the end. So I think that's part of the sort of distinction that you're drawing. I don't think it's priorities.
So, Chris, do you want to add to your view, because they've mostly dissented from your view that it's one or the other, that you have to have a priority. Do you want to comment here?
Well, in the spirit that everybody in this room will keep this confidential, I'm sure I can trust all of you. Let me be both candid and somewhat cynical that I think language is important, and language sends certain messages, and in order to create a different language to describe this phase of the project, to call it a transportation project was a meaningful switch in the language that we were using, because it had been so burdened by other forms of language, and that we had to find a way to describe it differently. Everything that I just said is completely in sync with what you also heard. So whether that was a cynical manipulation of language to get success for getting federal funding and bringing a team together, then it worked.
Speaking of funding, I'm going to start with Chris again. Look, it seems to me the world has changed.
Finger on the pulse. Yeah,
Thank God
ARC is
he's-
dead. ARC is dead.
ARC is dead.
The Tea Party is going to have a huge influence in what the next Congress does on a transportation bill. All the New York City cloud in the House is washed away. Where's the money going to come from?
I think this is, people need to understand that this is a very, very difficult time for the Northeast, difficult for New York, difficult for New Jersey. I think, for example, the Obama announcement of a $50 billion infrastructure fund is wishful thinking at best. Appropriations out of Washington will be meager at best. I think the transportation bill, if it ever comes back, will be largely a continuing resolution rather than a bold new step in new initiatives. That's the background. I think nonetheless, with leadership by President Obama and Secretary LaHood under the notion of high-speed rail, that if that is a big tent that can allow projects like the Northeast Corridor to move forward with a station which would accommodate the traffic that the Northeast Corridor can in fact represent for this country and the amount of wealth that it drives within this country. I think that there is, within that larger gloomy vision, that there are strategic opportunities that I think candidly President Obama and Secretary LaHood are keen on driving in the last 2 years of the administration. And I think tactically the language that we use.
I think you're supposed to say the last 2 years of the first term, but anyway.
Yes, exactly. And I think the language that we used has given them a framework to be a meaningful partner, to be strategic about getting those pots of money that are out there that could drive funding for the next phase.
Julia, the RPA spends a lot of time on these issues. What do you think?
I'd also like to add to what Chris was saying, which is that federal funding will be necessary, but also the Farley site comes with significant amounts of development rights that will allow developers to contribute a significant amount of money to the cost of the entire project. So that will also be helpful. Of course, the real estate market has to come back before that's possible. I guess I'd like to go back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier about whether this is a transportation or real estate project here or economic development project here, because it's relevant. You know, I think we all know intuitively that faster transportation increases the value of the communities that are served by it, and obviously New York is a prime example of that. But even within New York, every incremental improvement in transit has an effect on property values, whether they be residential or, in the case of Manhattan, commercial. Unfortunately, there have been very few studies of that. On the residential side, I've actually done a study that showed the very significant effect that ARC would have had on home values near a train station. And I'm in the process right now of trying to figure out what the value is of access to the labor pool and how that is reflected in commercial office rents in Manhattan. But the more this project can have significant economic transportation benefits, the more valuable the property and the neighborhood will be, which should help, you know, generally private investment in the project.
Sean, where do you think the money can come from?
Well, you know, I think it's important to remember the extraordinary precedent set by the number 7 line, because I don't know that they're infinitely tall, Anna, but the biggish buildings over on the west side is really what is funding the number 7 line. And I think it's extremely important for people to understand this, that when the number 7 line was conceived as an extension, that it was also understood that that money was not going to rain down from Washington, D.C.
Even the MTA wasn't going to spend it out.
Right. That money had to come from somewhere else, and that because we had a very deficit, hawkish administration. It's not like They were, oh, yeah, they were running up the deficit, weren't they? I forgot. Sorry, but just sideline. The point being that the number 7 line's getting extended today. There are tunnel boring machines in the ground right now because we figured out a way to pay for it, right, through the economic development. And I still believe that that will be critical to Farley in terms of getting it built. I think, I think RPA did incredible work with ARC in trying to make that case to New Jersey, and I think there's still a strong case to be made that some form of new Trans-Hudson capacity will add to property values, and there should be a way to tap into that growth.
So we woke up this morning, or if you went online last night, to find out that the Bloomberg administration is pushing a plan to take the number 7 line to Secaucus as a replacement for ARC. Chris, what's your response to that?
You haven't had a question in a while.
He comes next. He comes next. We know what he's going to say.
Well, look, let's really face the reality, as Juliet was just sort of going through, that Governor Christie canceled ARC for clear gubernatorial reasons within the state of New Jersey. But the Hudson River is still there. There's still, I don't know, 140,000 people who are in New Jersey, who will be in New Jersey, who would like to get to their job in New York City and use that job to pay for their mortgage of their house in New Jersey. So the problem persists, and I give the mayor credit for focusing on the idea that there are very few other alternatives given the 10 years of work that went into ARC, and that the idea of extending the 7 train goes back, I believe, about 10 years when PB and the MTA were looking at it when the 7 train was going to be an MTA project. Because you can't, as I think Vishan and Anna have said, you can't trap the west side of Manhattan you can't develop it, and you would trap it unless you had a solution. I think what we have to be careful of, which is in a way what we're all talking about today, is let us not overburden the 7 train alternative and think that it is going to miraculously spring up and be ARC 2 within 20 minutes, and that somehow the tunnel boring machine that's down there now, we just say, yippee, take off over to Secaucus. And
I want to know what's going to happen to that machine. Are we going to leave it in the ground?
And then it'll pop up, and then we'll have a tunnel. So there's a lot of hard work that's going to have to go into it. But I will also tell you, and I kudos for the mayor to take a leadership to say we have to solve that problem. But I also have to tell you that the Port Authority, who is charged with addressing these Trans-Hudson problems, we can't even rely on just that as being the next and only alternative. There are other major ideas that we're going to have to come up with, because New Jersey lives off Manhattan, northern New Jersey lives off Manhattan, and Manhattan must have that educated workforce to fuel the office market that everybody here is talking about. So there are a lot of other good ideas, if you want to ask me later what they might be, besides the 7 train, but I think we have to solve that fundamental problem even with ARC dying.
So I don't know what you thought when the story leaked last night, whether you were glad because you were coming here or whether you weren't happy that the story leaked. So tell us the Bloomberg administration's thinking on this issue, and tell us whether the cash-strapped city has any money for such a project.
Well, just first I want to amend your statement that the administration is pushing this. This really is a nascent idea. As Chris said, it's an idea that's been around for a long time, and ARC was a great project, and so we were, fully hoping that would continue, and it addresses a lot of the problems that my colleagues here have mentioned. And it's now that that has died, and again, I think the Governor Christie had valid concerns. We're basically trying to be creative about what are other alternatives, because as Chris said, the river's still there. The basic fundamental disconnect between a workforce and parts of Manhattan, and we function as a region, and so the fact that there are lines. Political lines between Manhattan and northern New Jersey is sort of artificial. I mean, if you look at it, the map, northern New Jersey is closer to parts of Manhattan than Staten Island. And it's just sort of politically arbitrary that there are two different political jurisdictions, but the fundamental reality is that we function as a metropolis. And so we're trying to be creative about how we address that solution. And as Chris said, I think the 7-line extension would not be the end-all be-all, but there is a fundamental issue we need to address.
It's a $5 billion not end-all be-all? Sounds like a lot of money.
Well, I mean, I think Chris's statement earlier in his beginning, when he talked about, you know, the first phase of Moynihan, only $267 million. I mean, it's kind of, to do anything is incredibly expensive. But again, it's this long-term vision. This is what makes the city's and the region's economy work. So we have to make these long-term investments. And I think when you look at the lessons of Moynihan, I mean, part of the problem is these kind of long-term decades. I mean, Chris mentioned Central Park. You look at the original subway system, you know, the GW Bridge. Many of these investments are enormous investments. And I think that's the fundamental thing. And the mayor's been consistent about saying this, that we have to think long-term. We have been too long coasting on previous investments. And the Minneapolis Bridge, for example, is an example where we've sort of, I think, as a society, not woken up to the fact that we need to make these investments. That's what is the basis for our society. So we have to think about $5 billion investments, because otherwise we'll wake up 20 years from now and we'll be stuck.
Sean, you know, you talked about the 7 line and the towers and all that. When Chris came to my class a few weeks ago and ARC was a thing, he wondered what ARC's demise might mean for projects on the west side. If you couldn't bring in all these additional New Jersey workers, would the west side be viable? What do you think?
Look, at some point, Penn Station was designed for about 120,000 passengers a day. Today, about 550,000 passengers go through that station a day. It's more than LaGuardia, Kennedy, and Newark combined. Right there, if we're going to grow, something has to be done for the capacity for the city, but for the west side in particular, clearly there has to be a trans-Hudson solution. Now look, ARC, $5 billion, yes, a lot of money, but it's potentially all the capacity, potentially.
The 7's 5, ARC was like...
Right, exactly.
As much as 12.
Right, so it's potentially all the capacity for almost half the cost, and that is a potential home run. It also achieves something that was a long-held dream for ARC, which was to connect ARC all the way to Grand Central, which number 7 already does. So this idea requires very serious consideration. It could be extraordinarily important for the development of the West Side. But again, it has to be thought about, I think, comprehensively with what happens at Moynihan as well and the entire vision for the West Side.
Anna, what would the community think about all this, do you think?
Well, it's underground, so what happens, you know? Right now, the 7 train is getting built. It's going to have 1 stop. Everyone hoped that it was going to have a second stop at 10th Avenue and 41st Street, but I guess we've had a do-over on that one, and the second stop is out. So, yeah, why not run it to New Jersey? You know, I think you asked an important question about the impact of the failure of ARC on the potential for development on the far west side. And Vishon alluded to the financing mechanism that's paying for the number 7. It's important for everyone to realize that the bonds that were sold to pay for the number 7, basically we hawked all of the expected revenues in that 59-block area surrounding the rail yards to pay for those bonds. And if that development doesn't happen, there's no money to pay the bonds back, and the city of New York is on the hook. I don't know where we are on the schedule that was laid out for the expected degree of development. I believe at this point that revenues from development were supposed to begin flowing in to be able to pay back those bonds. But obviously the financial collapse in 2008 is much more dramatic than even the doomsday vision laid out in the bond documents was. So you know, those bonds are a fairly risky proposition for the city. And if the development doesn't occur, the city has a big financial problem to face. So that would be a puzzle that would have to be solved if you were thinking about putting more money into the number 7 to get to New Jersey.
You know, one of the issues ARC raised was why these costs go completely out of control. You know, it was $9 billion, and the next day it was $12 billion, and essentially Christie said, I don't know where it's going to end. Vishon, why do projects like this go so out of control, and are there concrete steps we can take to make sure that doesn't happen?
I mean, what's clear is, so I think that these numbers, at least in their ratios, are correct. Last year, we spent as a country about $3 billion on intercity rail. China spent about $42 billion by comparison. You then factor in the difference in terms of what you get bang for the buck, because obviously in China you're dealing with non-unionized labor, you're dealing with far less environmental regulation. I'm not advocating any of those things, but clearly this is an enormous competitive problem for us as a city and as a region. And so we have to figure out how to get these costs under control. And I think that means project labor agreements with the construction unions, because negotiating great benefits is useless if the project doesn't happen. But I think it also means that we really have to look at the sort of middle management overhead structure that is part of these projects as well, which has also ballooned in more recent years.
Why? Why?
That's probably a question better asked of my public sector colleagues, right, actually.
You want me to answer it?
Sure.
It's the wrong question, actually.
Okay. You can change the question.
Yeah, because, I mean, this is the thing that really annoys me. Because take the big dig in Boston. And this is the paradigm that we are now living with. That Boston, I don't know if any of you have been to Boston. Boston spent about $12 billion to build the big dig. It started out as a $2 billion project because everybody said no one can stomach the idea that this is a $12 billion project. So let's start small for Tip O'Neill, and it'll grow over time. Well, what that did is it fed into the perception that somehow all of the things that the big dig was going to get built was going to get built for $2 billion. It was never going to get built for $2 billion. But Boston got $12 billion worth of infrastructure. It got 2 tunnels. It got a bridge. It took 93 below grade. It put a park on top of it. You put all that together, something of that size and complexity and dimension is going to cost you $12 billion. We will never be able to go back to that sort of manipulation of funding within the federal process by sort of starting low and grow big.
Well, we would agree that's a good idea, though, right?
Yeah, if you could get away with it, it's, you know.
It's a good idea that we're not doing it.
Oh, sorry.
Chris could probably get away with it.
Yeah, I'm trying. So when people say that ARC suddenly ballooned and was a project that was, you know, $9 billion, and you woke up the next day and it was $14 billion, everybody who was working on the ARC project fundamentally understood that it was not going to be a $9 billion project at the end of the day. The federal process of how you get money and how you work through to get the $3 billion that the Fed hamstrung or put everybody in a straitjacket that said, to get the $3 billion, you've got to say that you've got $9 billion. And because of that, when it became the real number, everybody said, that's a cost overrun. We have to come to grips with how we talk to the public about building large-scale projects, let them know that costs are risks, and that when you are candid about what you think it's going to be, you tell them where the risks might go. ARC was risky because Manhattan real estate prices could go up, inflation was uncertain, acquisition costs of property in terms of condemnation was extremely risky, and the construction of a project in a residential mixed-use neighborhood that was going to require mucking out Grand Central, you know, stone below grade is an incredibly risky proposition because the community says, no, you can't run dump trucks 6 days a week, 24 hours a day, even though that would get you a faster built cavern. It's unacceptable to the community that there's that amount of traffic. That's why these costs went up. But we have to, as a city and as a country, need to begin to be clear about why large-scale projects are expensive and embrace large-scale expensive projects, because that's what, in fact, we're building. But now you should ask me a little bit about what are the other alternatives before the 7 train.
I have it on my list, but we'll get to it now. What are the other alternatives beyond the 7 train?
In recognition that I think any tunnel project, and you know, if the 7 train is the extension, it's going to have a life that will be complex, large engineering challenges that I think the city's memo and what PB's talked about. But one of the unknown factors, one of the unknown realities is that more people come into Manhattan by bus on New Jersey Transit than come in by train. Buses are different than trains in the sense that they can go anywhere people are versus people having to get to trains. And as a result of rolling stock, they're far more flexible. And groups like Tri-State Campaign and Transportation of Alternatives, looking at a lot of issues with the MTA, have really begun to look at whether or not there could be a Northern New Jersey bus strategy for a 15-year solution to the larger term heavy rail solution that the ARC collapse has now taken. The challenge for that is buses in Manhattan, and then how would the Port Authority be able to accommodate, say, an additional 1,000 buses coming into Midtown Manhattan carrying 110,000 people as come in today in the peak period. That type of planning is what the Port Authority is focusing on now, because we think it can be a reliever, it's flexible, it can be sustainable, and that New Jersey Transit would have to run for community reasons, zero emissions or low emission vehicles, because the Jersey communities are not going to tolerate diesel buses, particularly queuing up in front of the Lincoln Tunnel. And it's going to require us to solve the capacity problem of the existing bus terminal in Midtown by building some type of high-velocity bus garage so buses don't go back to New Jersey empty, come back into Manhattan empty in the evening peak and pick people up. I think that, though, can be a way to bring workers into Manhattan at far less of a cost than a longer-term heavy rail project that would be valuable for the rest of Manhattan even after a 7 train got built.
Juliette, what do you think of that idea?
I think that well, I will acknowledge that there are a lot more people coming in to Manhattan every day from New Jersey by bus, and in fact, there are a few more people who come in by car than by New Jersey Transit, which is, I guess the shares are about equal, but
Yeah.
I think. I will say, though, that the two modes of transit, buses and rail, have very, very different impacts on the New Jersey side. Now, they might both facilitate people coming in and getting jobs in Manhattan, but in terms of density of development, efficient growth on the New Jersey side, rail has a very, very different impact, because the benefit of rail only extends a mile or two away from train stations, whereas bus stops are really spread out and scattered throughout the state. And that matters both for, environmental reasons, community building reasons, and just the cost of paying for and maintaining all the infrastructure, the road infrastructure and other infrastructure in New Jersey.
So I want to, before we open it up to questions, I want to deal with two issues, and I want everybody to get a chance to respond to these two. The first one is, okay, we have the money for phase 1. It's going to happen. What do you think should be the priority for phase 2 that would be realistic to get done in phase 2? And we'll start at the far end.
It's a good question. Ultimately, as we've discussed, the core of the project is good functioning transportation. It's a very capacity-constrained station, and as Juliette pointed out, the 5% doesn't sound like a lot, but having that, if you do any system dynamics, that at the margin, it's sort of like when you're on a crowded highway and someone taps on the brakes, the whole thing backs up, and so that marginal transportation capacity is really quite important. And so I think the foundation of phase 2 also has to be transportation related. It has to make the station function even better as a station, as a gateway to the city, both from the region as well as from the whole Northeast corridor.
Do you have a specific what that would be?
I don't. I mean, I think as Chris and Tim have pointed out, the original larger vision failed because it was too grand, and I think it really requires some careful thought to make sure that we go about the second phase in a way that doesn't collapse under its own weight, yet provides the critical improvements we need. So it's not an easy task, and so I think it's a good question, and I can't say that I have a specific answer.
Anna?
Yeah, I would think the real focus ought to be to realize the promise of the really remarkable agreement that was reached to bring Amtrak to the Farley building. I mean, that's what's going to be the fundamental change over there, that it's going to make everybody's life a lot easier. We're going to have, and no one's mentioned in the course of this conversation that we're dealing with a landmark building that everyone's very excited about having a use for, that lives up to the grandeur of the architecture, which is, after all, what Senator Moynihan's vision was. So if you get the long-distance traveler into an elegant building like the Farley, and you leave the commuters in, knowing how to use their little chutes in Penn Station, that's going to untap all kinds of potential, I think.
Commuters will be thrilled. Juliette?
Gosh, I guess I'd like the project to not only give us a great train haul and sort of bring rail into this new era of respectable transportation, but also to keep on thinking about the transportation benefits of the project. Moynihan Station, the first phase of it includes some transportation benefits for sure. There are also, in addition, there are also other benefits. There are other elements of the project that are not part of phase one that would actually continue to increase the number of people who could get in the morning. The diagonal platform underneath is sort of a 13th platform that could be used for transit users that is now used for, is it used at all? I don't think it's used at all. Some of the New Jersey transit platforms could also be extended out eastward, which was part of the original plan and has sort of since been forgotten because of ARC, but could be picked up again. And I think that if this first phase is defined by the transportation improvements and the second phase gets taken over again by the beauty, city building improvements and the real estate improvements, I'd like for it to also remember to continue improving the transportation elements.
Vishon?
I agree with everything that's been said, including especially the importance of this Amtrak agreement, which I think is critical. But I think it's also, for a long, long time, the thing that was perpetrated on the public of New York was this idea that if you built a station in Farley, all of Penn Station was going to move lock, stock, and barrel into the Farley building.
I thought that forever.
I think the vast...
And I was briefed by people like you.
Well, no. The vast majority of New Yorkers believe that. They were, I think, at times led to believe that. And I'm still wondering about the moment when, after we've done all of these great things, and the 25,000 people a day who use Amtrak, as opposed to the 525,000 people a day who use the remainder of the station, are going to wake up the day after the ribbon cutting, and we've spent, say, $1 billion on building a station in Farley, and I'm all for that, right? That to get additional transportation improvements, as Juliet is saying, that I think we have to figure out how to figure out things like the air rights and other mechanisms that we have at our disposal to improve the lot of the commuter between 7th and 8th Avenue, where they will forever be because that's where their tracks are.
I can tell you when I figured this out is when Shelley Silver vetoed Plan 1. And he vetoed it because he said the only one who benefited was New Jersey Transit. And I said to myself, that's not what I've been told, is it? And I went looking, and he was more right than that. You get it. You don't have to answer this one. Excellent. Last question from me before we turn it over to the audience. We've heard a fair amount about lessons, but what's the one important lesson in your mind for big projects in general? What is the overriding lesson that we ought to learn so that we don't have another Moynihan Station 10 years and we're on a $240 million project? Chris?
Hi. This is a really cheesy answer, but I think it's finally political leadership. I think there was a time, for example, when the larger project, Vishon just ended with the reality of this project won't solve the commuter challenge for everybody who's in Penn Station. I think there was a time when the massive project could have happened, and I think it failed to happen because of the right political leadership with the right people working on the project and who had an ability to turn that vision into a reality to get it built.
Vishon?
Keep the governor out of the Mayflower Hotel. I mean, we were...
That was customer number 9 for those of you who don't have a
They asked me to make this entertaining. I guess I didn't have a problem. Julia?
Well, no, look, I mean, look, Chris is right. We came very, very close to getting the big project to happen. It was a doable project. Today, there would be a new arena being built in the back of the Farley building. There'd be a station being built in the Farley building, and we would have set the stage for a brand new station where Penn Station sits today. It was an extraordinarily great opportunity for the city, an extraordinary failure on the part of, well, really all of us, to come together and get this done. But I do think we were very close until the demise of Governor Spitzer. The Garden walked away from that deal 3 weeks after the governor resigned.
But
so,
wouldn't, I do want to, but wouldn't the financial crisis have changed everything?
No,
anyway, don't you think?
I actually don't think it would have, because I think the Garden would have been under construction. And so I think that, you know, would there have been a workout on bonding and all of that? Probably, but I think the net benefits of the project were so extraordinary that it would have kept going.
Juliet?
I think that in addition to political leadership, by which I think I gathered Chris meant gubernatorial leadership, I think we also need to empower our administrative agencies to, or at least one administrative agency to really truly be in charge of this project. I feel like there were a lot of cooks in that kitchen, which, you know, in a sense does help to make a project better, but also can also seriously slow down a project. I mean, in the case of Moynihan Station, there were 4 transit agencies and the Port Authority and USPS and Congress and the, you know, not to mention the private developers and MSDC, of course, and it in New York City. And anyway, the list just goes on and on and on. And to have all of these stars lined up on the same project at the same time, at a time that there's funding available, is just a lot to ask.
Anna?
Yeah, well, it's not a good thing to have all of us say the same thing, but I think the fundamental problem was that there was no strong public leadership. And the reality is that the private sector, the joint venture, was really driving the process to build a consensus to try and make this happen. And I can remember sitting in loads of meetings trying to figure out, how can you get the mayor to stand up, this is important? How can you get the governor, can we get the governor and the mayor to come to 8th Avenue and say together, this is important? It never happened, and I think that's why this failed.
DeCumbo?
Maybe a slight variant. I think the ambition of the project in question has to be commensurate with the level of political support. So I think if you have real leadership, you can do something really visionary. If you don't, you have to be cognizant of that fact and scale the ambition to the level of commitment by the various people involved. And I think sometimes what happens is we get out over our head of our skis, and I think a great vision is great, but it has to be matched by the level of support. And if those two things are aligned, then I think you can reach success.
Chris, it's great to say we need political leadership, but, you know, governors are elected for 4 years, right? I mean, what did Chris Christie see in the Arc Tunnel? He was going to be gone, hopefully maybe be president or something. How do you get that political leadership in an environment like that?
Well, I think we have. I mean, you know, we shouldn't just dwell on the fact that things have collapsed. You know, that there have been right political leaders in this town at the right time. The mayor has, you know, the 7 train pulled that off. You know, Mayor Koch did one of the most amazing housing projects, you know, that the city's seen in an incredibly difficult time. So, you know, and you can tick off, you know, other examples elsewhere. So I think we, in some respects, we almost don't think that political leaders can get these things done, and that there should be a level of public support for elected officials who are willing to try to get those things done. But I think it's happened before. I think this one happened at the wrong time.
Yeah, hello. My question is always the same. I mean, isn't this just political grandstanding on the part of New York City, whoever the players are involved? I mean, how come you never talk about the impact that these projects will have on what's going on across the river in cities like Newark and Trenton and Camden? They're horrible cities. Crime is off the charts perennially in these cities. They never talk about these things only on this side of the Hudson. How come they never talk about what's going on the other side of the Hudson? And last time I checked, by the way, Port Authority does need a makeover. So it's always interesting to me how they always discuss what the impacts can be done in New York City, jobs and people commuting. I mean, last time I checked, I mean, the property values in New Jersey would benefit if New Jersey Transit, the bus, were to have, you know, immediate impact of what's going on in those surrounding areas. I never understand that. It's always about what's going on in New York City. What about the rest of the region.
Chris?
Well, geez, I think that's actually quite unfair here. Let's be clear, this was about Moynihan Station, which happens to be in New York City. So if you want to talk about what the Port Authority is doing in New Jersey, I'd be glad to go through the $1.5 billion that we're spending to deepen the harbor to make sure Newark and Elizabeth is in fact creating the 250,000 jobs that, you know, are fueling as best it can the economy of New Jersey. I can talk about the $4.5 billion that we want to spend at Continental, you know, to expand aviation capacity at Newark. I can talk about the almost $4 billion that the Port Authority has put into the PATH system to make that probably one of the best mass transit systems in the country. So, you know, the Port Authority is equally committed to New Jersey in terms of the physical infrastructure that we control. I happen to be a victim of being asked to be on a panel today about Moynihan, but there, you know, there is a lot of things that I'd be glad to talk to people about if the topic was, what have you done for New Jersey?
In the back?
My name is Maura Moynihan, and my father was the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who created this project. I spent 15 years having dinner with him and listening to him conceive it and push it, and sometimes on the verge of tears about the lack of political support and excitement. And after 9/11, he had retired in 2000. He urged the city and state to make Moynihan a priority to show that New York was still standing tall. So he died in 2003, and I moved to New York to start Friends of Moynihan Station. And then I got a phone call from a high official in the Bloomberg administration, who shall remain nameless, who said, do not push Moynihan Station. The priority is going to be Jets Stadium in the Olympics. To which I responded, but don't you need a new and improved train station to get millions of people to Jet Stadium? I never received an answer. And 7 years have now gone by, and Moynihan has lain fallow, but two enormous sports state arenas have been built with public money. And Senator Moynihan always said that money spent on transportation is not spending, it's investing. And I think the city has pursued a disastrous development priority here on luxury condominiums, luxury housing, sports stadiums. The subways are crumbling. We're in a terrible financial crisis. I don't know why the mayor's office has hitherto seemed not even to be enthusiastic about this project. And what would it take to get the mayor's office? I've never met you before, but maybe you will be the person that will get the mayor's office to really make it a priority, because there has been way too much money spent on the private sector, and going to a sports event is a luxury and an option, but having good public transportation is not.
So Tacumbo, I guess you get your chance to defend yourself.
Yeah, well, we are extremely enthusiastic about the station. As I said earlier, I think that good public transit is fundamental to the city. The city would not exist, the modern city of New York would not exist without good transit. So the mayor gets this. This is why the 7 train, the city, although the MTA is not within the city's control, it's not within the city's purview, and this gets to, I think, what Vishant said earlier, that there's a distinction between what the city controls and what the city does not. The city has made a point, and the mayor, in terms of sustainability, has really pushed mass transit, and that's where we have, you know, again, it's not the same as heavy rail, but bus rapid transit and other forms, because we understand that transit is critical to the city's economic health and overall health. I also want to, I have to mention that the city has not spent public money on the stadia. There's a distinction, again, this is a difference between public finance and actual spending public dollars. So the city has not, both of the stadia have been built with private dollars. The city's obviously been supportive of that, but it's different than the city investing its own dollars in the stadium. But back to your fundamental point, I agree with the senator that investment in transit is money well spent. It's actually savings, it generates everything else that's the lifeblood of the city, and that's a fundamental thing for the city's future health. And we are extremely supportive. I sit on the board, on Tim's board, and this is very much a city, state, and now federal partnership, and the city is going to be as supportive as we can be to having this project advance.
Just a little factual thing. The city did not build the stadiums. It did provide several $100 million in infrastructure improvements around the stadiums, in addition to the tax-exempt bonds, which I agree are private financing. It's easier if you stand up, by the way, when you ask the question.
Hi. So you were talking about how you're having a small initial phase one so that you can continue and have hopefully the bigger project be completed in the future. And you mentioned the person at the beginning of this, Robert Moses, who started, at least to my knowledge, that sort of idea. He would put some pilings in with a little bit of money and then say that would be ruined unless you did the whole project. Why he was able to do that was the extreme amount of power he had with his authorities. But that has since been checked. So what do you have in place that will ensure that phase two, phase three will be as large and as important as you want it to be, and it will not just end up with 8 more tracks that won't make a big difference?
I guess that's directed to you, Chris. Well, first, let me ask you, would you like to have Robert Moses' power?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think if we knew that Chris would live forever, we'd have a better answer.
Who wouldn't?
All power, what is it, all power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
That's a canard. Shop-worn cliche. There are no promises on this one. There is no certainty we get to phase two. I think everybody here has been, pretty candid that this is not a sure thing. The money that Greg's asked all of us about is not there. So there is a modest sense of success will breed more success. The conversations with the federal government have been very encouraging. And so this is not a, lock this in and it's all going to come. This is, let's get something meaningful started, and as people see progress, federal funding partners, private sector partners, and the next phase of the deal will happen. But this is not a sure thing by any means.
I'm Roxanne Warren. I'm an architect and chair of the Vision 42 proposal for light rail in 42nd Street, river to river. Chris and Juliet, you both mentioned that buses bringing people in from New Jersey would be much cheaper. And obviously that's true. And you pointed to the advantage of that they can collect people in a flexible way from various parts in New Jersey and bring them in. However, the impact of all the buses on New York City streets is lamentable. It's already overbearing, overwhelming on 42nd Street, for example, or wherever people are lining up at rush hour and the buses are lining up, you can't see the stores. It ruins the city. And I don't know what the answer is. But
I think Chris Spray has a response to that.
Well, first of all, I think people should notice that Juliet and I were very, gracious to her. So Juliet was knifing me when she was talking about the benefits of rail.
I noticed.
Yeah, did you get that? Yeah, it was great. Just so you all understand, in the way panels operate, that was a knife moment. She was really going, that bus things are crap. They don't work. And everything Juliet said is true. She's absolutely right. I am not trying to oversell the bus solution, but what I am trying to do is make clear that we have to solve the Trans-Hudson problem, and that there might be meaningful ways you can do it that are beneficial.
But you don't expect those buses to be traipsing New York City streets. Don't you want to bring them in and hold them around Port Authority?
To get back to Roxanne's question, I think this is the reality of where we are with buses today. That lumbering rhinoceros, dance that you see in the evening rush hour is that the buses coming back from New Jersey empty, having to do that queuing line and come up 10th Avenue to get into the bus terminal empty and be there when the 506 going back to Plainfield has to get loaded in less than 5 minutes, and then the next bus has to come in and fill that slot for the 526 or whatever to another town. We need to make sure that by building a large high-velocity bus garage in Manhattan to get all those buses off the street, they're going right into the existing bus terminal in the most efficient way possible. But let me just end with it. Buses are one of the major quality of life challenges for the city as a whole, from the top of Manhattan all the way from the George Washington Bridge all the way down to the lower part of Manhattan. This is just dealing with one key part of it within Midtown. the passengers would still go to the bus terminal. The bus garage would be feeding buses directly into the bus terminal rather than having to be on city streets.
In the back?
My name's Alice Labrie, and I have some issues. I'm still suffering from 6th Avenue being changed to Avenue of the Americas. So we're...
They did?
In Harlem, we have 7th and 8th. Anyway, so Mr. Ward, somebody, am I going to keep the name Penn Station and Farley Post Office? I'm really confused.
No, it's going to definitely be Moynihan.
But Penn Station's still Penn Station.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right?
Penn Station is still going to be Penn Station.
Can't
Farley
wait.
will be Moynihan. Penn Station will be Penn Station.
Greg?
But they'll
Yes.
operate
Wait,
as
Bashan?
one station.
Go ahead.
I just think on the last question, a couple of us
Yeah.
had, Anna,
Yeah.
you want to say, I want to
Yeah,
say
you
something
know,
too
I
after Anna.
think, this whole idea of the bus garage is really, has some of the same tones as this Moynihan Station discussion, because in fact, there was a bus garage. If you look at the map, the great big vision map for Hudson Yards, there's a bus garage in it, a Port Authority bus garage, kind of pretty close to the Port Authority bus terminal. And I think what happened there is the Port Authority thought that was a good place to put it. The city thought it kind of got in the way of their Hudson Yards vision, and it fell off the table. Buses are an enormous problem in that neighborhood. So the solution that Chris is talking about is absolutely something to pursue, and it's great that it's back on the table. But we also have to solve the problem of the charter buses. Midtown is awash with people who come to theaters and museums and whatnot, and those lumbering rhinoceroses don't get to go into the Port Authority bus garage. They park on our city streets. So it's a huge problem to
So
take on.
can I just say, so the problem we have on the west side at some level of transportation is that Penn Station and the Port Authority bus terminal are vestiges. They are vestiges of a moment where people had to come in from a whole network of places in New Jersey, right? And then they were transfer points, right? Because Times Square wasn't redeveloped, there was no West Side plan, so people were coming into these places, right? And they were going either to Grand Central or they were going to Lower Manhattan, right? By and large, in terms of the numbers, right? That is no longer a truism today, right? We are trying to think about the West Side differently. And so I think it's an interesting place where the real estate community would, I think, very much align with the community board, right, in terms of saying this is the wrong way to think about the West Side. And so what I think is what is interesting about the number 7 line idea is that Secaucus is a convergence point for a bunch of trains in New Jersey. And so that transfer can happen in New Jersey, and then they're distributed into the transportation system. Similarly, you could imagine a world where the Port Authority bus terminal sat on the other side of the Lincoln Tunnel. And all those transfers happened there, and there was one bus rapid transit that brought everyone across 42nd Street, right? And you could transfer along the way, right? And so I think we need to think about these places in conjunction with the future we see for the West Side, not the past of the West Side.
I think we're in front here.
Yeah. My name's Steve
It's easier if
Lancet.
you stand up.
Oh, okay. My name's Steve Lancet. I compliment the mayor's office on thinking outside the box about the number 7 train. I think in addressing the bus problem, it would be best to move most of the transfer point out to New Jersey by extending the number 7, creating a branch of the number 7 line that would go directly out to Lincoln Harbor and Weehawken and to Secaucus. So there would, the net result would be 2 branches of the number 7, the one that the mayor is currently building and a branch that goes directly west. And the one that goes directly west would be able to get out to New Jersey in half the time it would take to pass through the Javits Center area. It would provide immediate access to Midtown for all the New Jersey bus commuters. And since we're all talking about what an enormous problem buses pose for the West Side and for New York City, it would seem to me that that would cut the Gordian knot here.
Sean, I'd like to ask you a question that's come up a couple times. Where do you think the state of the real estate market is and the appetite of the private sector firms involved, primarily Vornado at this point, in doing and helping out on these projects?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for Vornado, but I think that generally there is still a growing interest in new, if you look at One Bryant Park or the Goldman Sachs headquarters or the handful of new kind of office buildings that have been built around the city, that there are other tenants out there that are interested in that kind of space. And I think a lot of that space is going to end up on the west side. I think that space is interested in being close to transportation, close to the High Line, close to West Chelsea. So I think there is a future fairly robust market in the west side for, you know, the kind of space that could be delivered. The problem, I think, though, around Penn Station is that when Grand Central was built, a series of large parcels were created up Park Avenue that actually worked with the construction of the station. Penn Station never developed that way because the area is completely parcelized and it's extremely hard to do land assembly over there. There are very few big assembled sites. So there's a very significant distinction there, right, in terms of what kind of development you can get unless there's some solution to that problem.
I think we're in the back.
Hi, my name's Angel. I'm a student at NYU, and to Vishant's point earlier about needing a comprehensive plan for the area, I'm wondering if you and other members of the panel can comment on 15 Penn Plaza and the opening of Gimbels, and I know that that's connecting back to Herald, so eastward, but it also includes the economic development plan as well as a bundle of transit improvements. So how, if at all, is this project coordinating with 15 Penn moving forward? Whether it will be developed concurrently, whether it needs to be staggered, and what that impact on the community will be, as well as commuters from a disruptive standpoint.
DeCombo?
Well, 15 Penn is a private development, so in a certain sense, they're going to move according to their own time frame. It's obviously quite a large building which is envisaged there, so it's contingent upon some of the tenants that Vishant mentioned looking for space, what their credit markets are like, and essentially they're going to build it when it makes the numbers pencil out for them. So in a certain sense, I think, and this is the point that Tim has made, that Chris has made, that the Moynihan project, I think that the significant change that's been made in the current iteration as opposed to previous ones is that trying to build critical momentum now. So proceed with the $267 million first phase to make real transportation improvements today and get that underway. And even given that this has to happen, this is an extremely busy station, so a lot of the work that's happening is night and weekends only, because you can't just stop people coming to Penn Station for a year while you do the work. So it's going to take, 3-4 years for this work to happen. But it's really critical that we proceed with that immediately. So that, the train is leaving the station. And it's critical that we not wait for anything, that it's fully funded and, things are aligned, so we need to push that and, again, build that momentum. And really what happens with 15 Penn is going to be up to the developer and when they find both financing and tenants, which are related.
We're running out of time, so I want to ask each of the panelists to give us their best guess on what this project looks like in 2015 and 2020. Chris? 5 years and 10 years, right?
Right, so I would say, I'll be the optimist. I will say that the phase one will have actually morphed into some of the transportation, the diagonal platform, the other incremental parts of the project with federal support. And in 10 years, the Grand Hall will have begun, will have almost be finished.
Vishant?
I'm going to double down. I'm going to. I agree with Chris, but I also believe that so 2015, I agree completely. 2020, I think we will not only see the Grand Hall in Farley, but I actually think we will see a series of improvements in terms of light and air and access around the commuter station with development that's around it that will also work very much in conjunction with what happens in Hudson Yards. I think the whole thing could be a real winner.
Juliet?
All right, well, I hope both of these guys are right.
But?
No, I mean, listen, I don't know. All I'll say is that the momentum of inaction is very strong, and that I'd really like this phase one, the the momentum that we got from phase 1 to really launch us into phase 2. And if there is a way to move forward with federal support for the project before maybe the real estate market recovers, if there's a way to structure the financing in the way that we can, as somebody pointed out, just borrow enough stakes so that phase 2 gets started and the private developers will catch up when the real estate market comes back, that would be really wonderful. I'd love to see that happen.
Anna?
I think we'll probably see phase 1. People will think that that's, though modest, a marked improvement. I would hope the real estate market is back enough so that either 15 Penn Plaza or one of the 2 Brookfield sites is under construction and the area is beginning to come back. And I don't think we'll see any development on the rail yards.
Jay Cross says he'll have a tenant in months, by the way.
Listen, I gotta stay true to my hood,
Fighting words.
Although when Jay Cross came to my class, he said, I said, you promised a tenant by year end. He said, not by year end.
Yeah, no, I didn't say ever. This is my 2020 vision, not my forever vision.
Tacumbo?
So I'll continue with the optimistic trend. I think to build upon what Juliet said, I think optimistically, I think that the federal government as a whole recognized that New York City is a linchpin to not only Northeast Corridor transit, but that given that 75% of the air traffic delays in the country originate in New York City, that the nation will recognize that having better regional transit up through the Northeast Corridor and getting people out of planes and into trains between Boston, D.C., Philly, and New York will help alleviate some of the broader national congestion problems, that there'll be a rationale for significant federal investment in the project that really, I think, transforms, and this is to Vashon's earlier point about where the United States stands vis-a-vis China and other countries, Europe, that are investing, and that there's a significant investment that really transforms the way that the city, the region, and the country look at rail transit here.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Port Authority for sponsoring this, the New School for putting it on, and all of you for coming. And I'd like you to join me in thanking the panel for a lively and informative discussion.